means left shift. So LS left shift, and you're moving it by 2 bits. And so R1 doesn't have any change. R1 stays as a hexadecimal 1. R3 is the one that's going to be an important operation for you to use because you will have use of it in the next labs. You can also have a right shift, the same way you have a left shift. You could have it by 2 bits or 4 bits. I believe the maximum is 8 bits. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, I wanted to make sure. So say that instead of a hexadecimal 1, we had something like 1001. What would happen? So when we do the left shift by 2, then all the values that you have in that number are going to be shifting to the left. It's not just the first bit. All of those values that you have inside are going to left shift. So it will be something like that. It will move 1, 2, and then it will end up here. Okay, and say you had a right shift. So say that you started here with this number and you use LSR 2, then that will become this number. So I hope that helps with that. I had never seen this type of questions in the exam, but it's something that might work in your lab, specifically knowing that you can only use the registers from 0 to 12. I've seen that some of you try to use in the lab register 13 and 14. No, you cannot use them for general purpose, which is like to do addition, subtraction, to save your own content, because they have their own purpose. For example, 13, we already talked that one is the stack pointer. R14 is the link register. I'm not going to explain this one too much, but this one is important for the quiz too. This one and this one. This one specifically, if you want to do something with the interrupts, this one is going to say information, and I recommend you review more about these parts. So I'm just going to go in general what was lacking around. So some of you try to use ADR, so as you can see in this example, you can only use that if it's like, for example, a variable that you're using. So if you try to do ADR R0 N, okay, good, perfect. I took that as the right thing. However, you have to take into account, however, that's not the right solution, because what you're actually writing is the address of the variable. So if you actually want to save the content that is in the variable, you always have to make sure that you put this information. And if you don't want to do that, don't want to remember that part, you could just do it the other way we were doing it, which was just using LDR. Now, another area that I noticed was that you guys never made sure that you had a loop and a callback to the loop. If it was the problem that you had an if, then okay, you don't need to make a loop. But in the case where you had a while, yeah, that's important, because you're gonna have this loop while, which is gonna repeat as long as this statement is true. So what's gonna happen is that, okay, you're gonna repeat this loop double, oh my god, double B? Well, this loop, you're gonna have this loop repeat as long as this statement is true, and this thing is gonna happen. And for you to actually make that happen, the while, you have to go back to the beginning, test, okay, is this statement true? If it's true, you keep going, else you get out. So many of you forgot to do that, and without that is not a while loop. It might look probably like an if loop. Okay, the comparison. So many of you, for some reason, didn't do the comparison right. So make sure to do the comparison, even if it's at 0. Something important that I noticed is that sometimes you don't even need to put a 0. If you put CMP R, and then R by mean R, the register of the value that you want to test. If you just put those two things, then it will compare it to 0. But if you want to, be sure and still put the 0, that's okay. That's good. Yeah, this is just an extra information. You have to imagine that it's like a subs with an S, and what that does is that it updates the NCBC. There should be a chart in the lecture with where it shows you the conditions and how they test the NCBC, and that might help you when you're trying to write the code. You can write that in your crypt sheet, there's no problem if you do that. That's actually what you should have in your crypt sheet, so write it up there. And for port, don't forget to put this up. Like, you have a section in the C code where it was n minus minus. That means that you are subtracting 1 from the n variable. That's it. And yeah, many of you forgot that in the code itself there was a part that was inside the while loop that said, okay, as long as this code is running, the code was something like, oh yeah, once you're inside, go to body. But since it's a while loop, it is understood that at one point that body is going to return. So you can keep going around in the loop. And there were 2 ways in which you could solve that. One was make sure that, okay, at this point when you're trying to do the branch call, you could write a BL. This BL just made sure that, okay, if you had your body, at the end of body, you have to make sure you write BXLR, which is your register 14, and that makes sure that you come back here once the body loop, the body function is over. And the other option, which was just writing here B instead of BL, and okay, so BXLR will return you here, and then at the end of this loop you have to make sure that you go back to the beginning of the loop, B loop or something like that. And if you do it the other way, where instead of writing BL you write B at the end of body, instead of writing BXLR you will write B loop. Okay, now the other problem, I think it was similar in this way, where you had to set the variable. It was, now that I remember, it was a K that had 32 bits. A difference from the first question where you had just a number. I believe n was something like 50. This number was okay if you tried to write LDR, or even if you wanted to use move, that was okay. But if you try to do move with a 32-bit variable, that's not gonna work. Yeah, that will be like minus point, because that doesn't work. The size is too big for move to be used. Okay, the comparison, I noticed some people try to use the if then else. However, if then else is for handling small sequences. You cannot do it this way about doing the if else then and then use a comparison. You have to do it the other way, because you need to use a condition in a branch. So if you try to do it, you will have something like this. And I would recommend you review your lab lecture 3 information, because I believe it said something like, oh, you cannot do branching out unless it is like the last execution. So you actually cannot have a branch around this section, I believe. But I would recommend you review that part. Usually we use this for addition, subtraction, or just adding a value in a register. And let's say, what was the other thing? Oh yeah, many of you forgot that you have to use the body. I think it was function 1 actually that was inside, like if these 2 conditions are true, then you do this action. Many of you forgot to do that action. And let's see, just make sure that the logic of the code that you're trying to imitate keeps having sense, like you follow their logic. This is an example of how you could do it. Like, say you had the main loop, then you try to compare, okay, so if this value is less than b, so we're going to compare those values, then okay, if it's less than, then that's part of the stuff that we want to be true. So it still has a chance to be true and for us to do this action. So let's go to the next testing stuff. Remember, this is and, so both of them need to be true for you to do this action. So the next one, you're comparing A and C. If A is bigger than that, then we can actually execute the next action. Else, then this statement is not true and we just get out to end. However, you have to be sure that in case that the first one wasn't true, then you automatically go to end. That's why I'm writing this part here. It's very important because many of you forgot to do that. And what would happen? So say that you are at the point compare. You compare that, you do this, and wait, your code notices, hey, no. In a given case that A is actually bigger than B, it's gonna skip this. And it's gonna go to the next line, which is gonna be, if you don't have it, it's gonna be body. So you're gonna execute this regardless, and that's not the code that you want to write. You want to go to end in case that is not true. So you have to make sure that, yeah, you follow the logic. And this is an example. You don't necessarily have to do it this way. You can find any other way in which you feel more comfortable in doing it. And yeah. I'm gonna go over some important information that I have noticed in the last semesters about the interrupt, but not about all of it, because I want you to, if you haven't had this information yet, then I don't want to overwhelm you. So I'm gonna go over this at the end. Actually, I'm gonna go over stuff that you know right now, that you should know. And let's start with the GPO configuration. You use that in your lab, and I'm gonna go over some stuff. I posted this in the Discord and in the Blackboard. There's an updated document. I believe the updated one is in the Blackboard. Make sure to review that, because for the GPO, the order of the registers is very important. So if you have it mixed up, it will not code, it will not run. So the first one always has to be the one that you use to define what port you're going to be using. Yeah, the order is very important. If you're trying to do the configuration and the code doesn't run, it might be because of the order. So check that if you have that in your code. So first one is always this register, because you need to enable the ports to be able to use it. So yeah, make sure that you save the address, then this make sure that you can write to the content. And here we are just making sure that we are writing only to this port. However, many of you were confusing on how to select the port, so let's go over it. We're writing the hexadecimal number 02. So when we convert that to a binary, it's not the same, it's just a conversion of binary. Okay, so we look, I think in the original I said this was a bit. I'm sorry if that was confusing. Let's think of this as pin, okay? So the first one is going to represent pin number 0. Second one is pin number 2. Sorry, 1. Confused that one. Okay, pin number 2. So we go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7, and so on. That's important because in the GPO registers, we usually use them to update or initialize or do something with the specific pins of that port. Okay, so if we were writing just a 1 here, that would be talking to port A. We will be enabling port A. But here we're only using this bit, and that's bit B. So this one alone is bit A, this one alone is B, this one alone is C, D, E, F. So when you were trying to do your lab 2, you were supposed to write 0x to 0, so you could talk only to port F. So be sure you check that. But in this example that I'm giving you, we're just writing to port B. Okay, so in this case it's pin. Sorry if that name confused you. So in this one, this is the pin, and we put a 1 in there, so that enables port B. Okay, then we store that value so it actually does something. If you don't do this part, then you're doing nothing, honestly. This because we need to give it some time to reload. And this is important because many of you had some problems in the lab, even though I already posted this, because you just copied this directly and didn't read this part where basically you need to do this section, which is saving the address, then making sure you write to the content, and then at the end storing that content. You always need to do that for those registers, and it becomes tedious. So I didn't write that because I expected you guys to read this part. Um, so the log, it depends. You don't need to do it for all the ports, only for PF0 and I believe for PB7. You can check in your lectures for the GPO what is the other number, the other port pin that you need to use it for, and it's a specific key number. So for PB7 it's going to be a different number that you need to save to. But if you are using PF0, you need to use this number. Okay, so in the example that will be talking in this video, uh, we are working with alternative functions, and I'll explain how to use both amcell and afcell. There's in similar situations, so let's see. Okay, this is the one that I'm going to be explaining later, but I want you to notice the order. First, you're going to define either amcell or afcell, and if you are using afcell, then you need to disable the amcell the same way that you have here by making the bit clear to all those bits so they don't interfere with each other. Let's see. Then after defining if you're gonna use amcell or afcell, you need to say, okay, what functions are we gonna use, and in what pins are we gonna use those functions. Then of course you do the direction, if it's gonna be digital enable. This is an important one, the order of this one, because I believe in the first document I sent this order incorrectly. This is the correct order. First you gotta do digital enable, then the CR. Usually your code tells you, Kale tells you, oh no, you have some problem there with CR. That means you just gotta organize the order. And after that, you use the port if we are doing something with a physical hardware, say with a DVC. We do this so we can protect the registers that we're gonna use, and so they don't burn out in the process. Your configuration, the simple stuff. As I said before, you already have the document that I shared with you in the class. You can check the lecture notes and review the book. And that normal GPO configuration is easy, I believe. You guys have an example in the lecture which is related to this part where you're configuring the port C. So again, as I said in the last video, you have to make sure that you first enable that port, then after that you are working with something different here, which is an alternative function. So this is how you will go if you were writing it on C. However, I don't think the professor will ask you to do it on C. You can talk with them tomorrow. You have a class Monday. You can verify with him if you can write on C or maybe it's only on assembly. Either way, you always have to make sure to write to this register for GPO. So first, activate the afcell. So you have to make sure that you write directly only to the, when you are writing to afcell, you're writing for the pins that represent PC4 and PC5. You're telling the code that, okay, these are the pins that are gonna have alternative functions. Then of course you gotta use the digital enable so you can use that in your code. After that, you're gonna use the PCTL, and the PCTL is different because the PCTL use it only after you had set up if you're gonna have a function, alternative function or not. And after that you had to say, okay, so we have an alternative function. Alright, and what is the function that we're gonna use, and to what pins are we gonna use those? So notice you have two steps in here, and there's a friendlier way to do it in assembly. I'm gonna explain that after this, but you also have to be sure that if you're using amcell, you gotta isolate, or more like disable, the pins that you're using for the alternative function, which in this case is PC4 and PC5, and you gotta disable that in amcell. Okay, so let's go down here. So this is what you're gonna use to know what to write in a PCTL. So in this case, we know that we are writing to not pp. Okay, what happened here? I must have wrote something and make this move. Okay, yeah, it's alright. Let me wait a little bit more. Oh yeah, you're gonna have a lot of tables, so be sure to also ask that in classroom. Okay, so you're using PC4 and PC5, and these are the alternative functions that you want. And what that means is that you're gonna write to these pins this specific number. But now let's say that you had another example and that it was asking you for this other function. You will have to write a 2 to those pins in the PCTL. So let's see how will that look like. So after you have done the MCL, and then this is what you're gonna write to the register. Okay, so for it to be friendly, you're gonna use another register so you can isolate those pins that you're gonna use. Why do we need to isolate it? Well, we don't know if there are other pins that are using another alternative function, or maybe GPO, or maybe AMCell. So we don't want to change that. We don't want to affect the other parts of the code. So for it to be friendly, that's why we use another register. Okay, so here you are selecting all the other pins except the ones that we're going to work with, and then you're going to end that. Wait, we're ending in R0, which is what already existed in this register. So say if you had those pins active or something, we do the end, so we make sure that they stay active if they were active. Okay, so after that we update the R2, so now we can only write what type of function we're gonna be using. So in this case we'll write a 1. But if it was in the case that I was telling you earlier, where we have to write to this alternative function, we will write a 2. Remember that this is hexadecimal, so we can write 1, 2, 3, or other numbers. And these numbers that you have here represent, okay, so the first one is gonna be, in this case we're working with PC, so this is PC0, PC1, PC2, PC3, and these are the PCs that we want to write, 5 and 4. So that's where we write the number for the alternative function. Then we make sure that is saved and we store that. That's how we will work it. And the reason why we do this part this way, wait, I'm trying to do the drawing, this part this way, is because we are representing that section with nibbles, and that's why we can write, oh yeah, this way, 1, 2, 3, the specific type of function like that. Okay, I believe you should practice this. There's an example in the lecture notes, so you should go about it with your Kale. Now the next part will be cystic. I will just go randomly at this point. So the lecture note that you have is really good the way it is already. However, I just wanted to make a comparison because in the last lab that you had to calculate the delay in a specific way, especially because you had to take into account that the 2 lines of codes that you had in the wait loop had a different way of doing the time. And you have to do a whole calculation, taking into account the period of the way the PLL affected the computer and the TFC, and then you had the period of the frequency that you wanted, and so you had to calculate that from there and take an average value so you could get the right delay. However, when we're working with cystic timers, it's going to be a little bit more simplified. You only need to take into account, okay, the frequency of the device that you're going to be using, which in this case the crystals of the Cortex M4 device that we're using is 16 megahertz. Ooh, I just put a C there, megahertz. And you're going to divide that by the frequency that you actually want. So that's how you're going to get the delay when you're using the cystic timers. Okay, and basically this is a copy and paste from the lecture notes, and it even explains step by step how to do it, so I will not go over it. I expect you read the lecture note for that. However, I will talk about cystic if you were working with it and an interrupt, how it's gonna appear, how do you know that a cystic interrupt happened, or how it will look in Kale. So first of all, there is this chart that you have I think in the book. So let's take into account one of the handlers that you have here. We're gonna take into big notice the number that you have here. When you're using a sysdig, the number IT is gonna appear as a 15. And so if we come back here and say to you, you had the kill, this is how it's gonna appear. IT 15, that's how you know an assistic interrupt happened. Now I didn't found, when I was doing this video, I didn't found the lecture notes on your for the interrupts in your blackboard, so I'll just go slowly over some points that I think are important. You still should read your lecture notes and go over the points, but these are things that I have noticed that are sometimes difficult for the students and that you should review. So first of all, how do you configure? So first you gotta configure the GPO, and then after that you configure the interrupt. The lecture notes should have instructions, but since it doesn't have it, here's a copy of an example that I have. So basically, once you're done with the GPO, you start here. This part is important. You are disabling the global interrupts. You gotta disable them first so you can actually edit all the stuff. And these examples that you have here is just basically saying, okay, so where are you gonna use, in what port are you gonna use the interrupt? Then are you gonna use edge detection? If that's so, what edge are you gonna identify? Is it gonna be falling or rising? And this is gonna define the priority. Let's see, this value here, you might get confused, so let's talk about it. Basically, the enabled register in this example, I got it from one that was working with port, I believe it was port 30, no, port F, sorry, it says here port F. Okay, so when we're working with port F, we come here, okay, port F, we gotta talk to the bit number 13, and we gotta use the enable register and 0. Okay, so once we do that, we save that value. Then after that, we write, okay, what are the pins that we're gonna use to receive input and that we're gonna detect for the interrupt. In this case was port F0 and F4. Then after that, you gotta, okay, enable again the global interrupts. So that's the general step for that. You're also gonna use these charts there until, I don't remember how to use this one specifically right now, but I guess it was when you were using URT, so maybe you don't need that one here. And let's see, so you use this for interrupts, by the way. This chart is for interrupts. And MBC pre, that's for saying what is the priority. An example that you were using above, we were writing to this specific bits to say that we were writing the priority. Where is it? Okay, here you have it, pre 7. And first you gotta say what pins are gonna be like using that, and then you say, okay, what is the priority? Okay, what else? Well, in case, that's the hardest part. However, since you haven't had that lab yet, I believe the only questions that you could have are the general ones, which are this part. So basically, how to identify that an interrupt happened, what gets changed, what are the steps when you go into the interrupt, and how to identify, what was the hardware that happened, or where the information was saved, or what was the address of the stack pointer. So yeah, this small chart is gonna show you a little bit about that. And how do you set the interload and refining KL? I think that's in general what you need for that. So as I said in the first video for Q1, you might want to test how the interrupt looks in KL, especially how it's saved in the memory, because as the last picture that I showed, you have to work with stacks when you are doing interrupts. So you want to know, how that looks like, how the memory gets saved, how do you find the address of the stack, and so on. This part here of how it's saved is explained in the first video. You can check that, and well, good luck.